Well, thank you so much for coming and also for those watching us online. I wanted to start by thanking the MA in Curatorial Practices, Stephen and the team, Ishin and Ricky, and now Connor, for always being so generous to me. I spent 6 months last year here with the Fulbright grant, and it was incredibly inspirational, but also just the opportunity of having discussions with colleagues throughout the process of setting up some sort of research project where I was looking at the notions of the social in relation to the neoliberalization of the cultural sector and what audiences mean in that context. And so it was very, very productive to be here and also with all the participants of the program. So thank you for having me again. So what I will be doing today with Maria is to look at this title that was set up by Stephen and to think about the intersection between rewiring institutions and the notion of the curatorial or curatorial practices. I want to start by doing that with telling you a very personal anecdote. So 15 or so years ago, I met Maria Lind, when I was a participant of the Curator Lab program that I believe still exists. So I was one of the participants in the program. And back then I was, I think, a young or younger curator for sure, but also a young curator trying to figure out the focus and the specificities of my practice. And when I got to the program, the director back then told me that there were possibilities of us to have some colleagues, so colleagues at Konstfack in Stockholm that could serve as our mentors. And when I saw Maria's name in the list, I was over the moon. And I was lucky enough to have Maria looking at my project and having conversations with me throughout the year, which was incredibly inspirational. Now, why is that important? Well, first, because it's the second time I'm seeing Maria after those years, but also because I was following Maria's work for some time, even before I joined Konstfack back then in 2009, probably it was. And one of the things that I was very interested in was one of the conversations that Maria was leading around the notion of curating and the curatorial. I don't know how familiar you are with this discussion, but for me, it was very foundational for my thinking around what's the role of curatorial practices today. So in a nutshell, I believe a few colleagues, a few theorists and curators realized that the term curating was a little bit short for what they wanted to discuss, and also practices that I believe they were seeing happening in the field that didn't quite operate at the same level as the kinds of curatorial projects that we were seeing. So in a way, curating was falling a little bit short for some other activities that were probably less declamatory, less visible, a little bit more in, as Irit Rogoff, one of the leading voices also in that debate, said and says, is practices that were taking place in the expanded field of exhibition practices and exhibition making. So in a nutshell, and of course here, this is not comprehensive. The debate is incredible. It starts, I think, in 2006, at least in terms of the written texts, 2006 with a text that Irit Rogoff publishes, where she starts looking at the differences between curating and the curatorial. I think it was followed by Maria Lind's text in 2009 with a publication in the Artforum. And then finally edited also as part of the book that Stephen mentioned. Beatrice von Wiesmark is also someone to look up for, because she was also very much involved in these debates later with the cultures of the curatorial project that she's still leading in Leipzig. So in a nutshell, curating, and you have to situate here this debate in the beginning of this century. was resonating probably too much, I think, for these thinkers with professional skills around curatorial practices. So let's say how to better organize an exhibition, to show artworks, to write an exhibition text. Also very much centered around the one format, exhibition making. And also, I don't know if you remember these discussions, maybe still some people are still entertaining these debates around how much airspace and visibility the curators were taking, overshadowing a little bit what the role of artists and other actors in the field. And so scholars and curators started entertaining, I think, this other term, the curatorial, no longer as an adjective to qualify things related to curating, but more to serve as a term on its own right. So there were things that became important for these curators. I just need to say that they were not necessarily in agreement. But the idea was not to make the curatorial mean one single thing, was more to shed light on practices that were happening, as I said before, in a sometimes kind of more low intense mode and also less declamatory. And so one of the things was to pay attention to the multiple formats that curators were using. Instead of thinking of exhibition only, exhibition would be one more format that was available, but also dialogical platforms, also publications, workshops, residencies, encounters, forums, and whatnot. So as Eric Rogoff usually says, it was not so much about like being good at making exhibitions, it was more about making sure that the questions and urgencies at stake were being asked and were being mobilized through the formats that better fit that discussion. So you would see all sorts of different cultural engagements emerging. The discursive was also part of the discussion. I think the documenta curated by Okwin Bezer was incredibly instrumental for this, not least the platforms that he curated back then. And the discursive here doesn't mean language that were used to talk about exhibitions or to explain curatorial activities, was more to think of how language could mobilize those very same curatorial questions and activities in the format of publications, talks, again, workshops, and other forums. The other thing that was important, and I think Maria might pick up this one today as well in relation to her work, is also the interest and importance of using the curatorial as a kind of a platform to set up critical inquiries. And what I mean here is not necessarily mobilizing the format to represent an idea, so say an exhibition that will represent a specific idea or concept, but more the possibility of throughout what usually are durational projects to activate those questions and to activate the conversations that will also produce critical tools for viewers and audiences and also organizers to address the questions at stake. Finally, before we move to another one that is related to institutions specifically, also in London, the think tank Curatorial/Knowledge was also thinking of how do we produce knowledge through curatorial practices, and to think how curatorial and cultural institutions are also sites of knowledge production. And finally, instituent practices. And I think here I'm using this term, but we could use others. And I'll give you a list of how colleagues have also, I think, referred to what I mean here as curators using institutional infrastructures. So the making and the workings of institutions as curatorial material or curatorial medium. And again, we're talking about practices that might not necessarily come across as something that we would identify as curatorial formats, but the ways in which colleagues working in institutions use their role there, and also the ways in which they think about recruitment, about structures of the institution, about funding, and also programming will become part of the same process instead of sitting as management or any other side activities. As I said, there's a lot of different ways of talking about this engagement of curators with these institutional infrastructures. Some colleagues talk about the fourth wave of institutional critique. Also, institution practices is something very used in the field. Para-institution here, I'm using a term that Paul O'Neill has been discussing, and this is a publication coming out soon that will elaborate on this notion a little bit more in depth. Instituting otherwise, a term that is usually used by Maria Lavayova and others, the director of BAC, unfortunately closed recently, and institution making and infrastructural critique. Infrastructural critique is a quite interesting articulation. Marina Wishmit came up with this notion and also taken up by others such as Bassam El-Barani. I could illustrate with some examples of institutions. I won't have time now for to kind of go through the different examples, but I just wanted you to know that some of these institutions or projects or collectives are sort of populating my mind when I'm thinking about these practices. And finally, just to mention a couple of things that I've been doing around these topics. When I was the head of public programs and research at Nottingham Contemporary, this is a contemporary arts center in Nottingham, UK. I had the opportunity to publish, to edit this publication, Institution as Praxis, New Curatorial Directions for Collaborative Research. And what we were talking about here and the contributors were basically reflecting on their practices precisely of enacting institutions otherwise, especially small-scale institutions, thinking also in relation to contested histories and also archives and collections. And the other thing we were also claiming here was the possibility of thinking of cultural institutions as sites of knowledge production that will definitely produce knowledge differently in relation to what you see happening in academia. So to think of what those epistemologies, methodologies would look like. I'm currently editing a series of publications on the curatorial, and the first one is coming up next month. So as for those of you that have experience in publications, you know that it takes time. So next month is really around the corner. So excited to see this one coming out, and Mick Wilson will be precisely engaging with the debate around the curatorial and curating, and focusing on the discursive and to think through that notion in relation to contemporary practices. So to finally end, I wanted to quote Lucia Pietroiusti. Lucia was a part of the series organized by Stephen here at SPA, meaning online, a series of curatorial roundtables that happen usually on Wednesdays. And Lucia is the head of ecologies at Serpentine. It's a very interesting format. If you're not familiar and interested in these institutional practices, I think it's interesting to see what she set up there. So as head of ecology, she leads the Department of Ecologies to think of an institution, obviously, as you can tell, as an ecology that is porous and not fixed and determined by the walls of the institution, and looking at all the different areas of interaction and networks that the institution establishes. And so Lucia, when she was talking about the role of cultural institutions, she shared this slide with us. And I just wanted to read it as for us to have a couple of ideas for our conversation as well after Maria's presentation. And so she said, what cultural spaces may need to become as conveners, as sanctuaries, platforms, dreamscapes, strategists, and laboratories. So maybe some of the things we can entertain after Maria's presentation during the conversation. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, the rest of the team, and all of you who are here in the space, and those of you who are joining us online. First, a reminder that art is always more interesting and more important than curating and the curatorial. So particularly to those of you who are students of curating or curatorial studies, art is always more interesting and important. That being said, I want to start with an artwork by Elle Hansa, or Hans Ragnar Mathisen, who is now in his late 70s, living in Tromsø on the Norwegian side of Sápmi, the land of the Sami people, in the town of Tromsø, which is north of the Arctic Circle. And since the 70s, he has used maps as his artistic medium. First, he began by replacing place names in the Scandinavian languages in Finnish for Sami place names. And then he began to play with perspectives. So in this particular map, he is in one go uniting all the many indigenous peoples of the Northern Hemisphere by using the North Pole as the structuring principle for the map. He was one of 9 Sami artists who participated in Documenta in 2017 in Athens and Kassel. And to this day, he continues his very refined and sensitive practice based on mapping in different ways. And most of them are distributed as posters. So he wants them to be seen. He wants people to have them at home. I've encountered them at schools, kindergartens, etc. They are there to be circulated inexpensively. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of where I'm at with my job as the director of KIN Museum of Contemporary Art. It's in Sápmi. Sápmi is the land of the Sami people. Sápmi stretches from Norway to Sweden, Finland, and the very north of Russia. And there are also different Sami areas, as you can see from this map. Kiruna is in the northern Sami area, the green part, and it is Europe's only indigenous people, the Sami people. And if you look at Sweden, which is where Kiruna is located, on the right-hand side, you see the red dot. It's almost as far north as you can go in Sweden. It's 200 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, as Gabriella knows very well. You spent several months there last summer. This means that you have the Arctic summers with light 24 hours, but you also have the Arctic winter when the sun does not rise above the horizon. And on the left-hand side, you can see a map of Sweden, and the top orange part, it's the region of Norrbotten. And the museum where I'm working now is both municipal and regional. So we're covering that orange area, which is roughly a quarter of the size of Sweden. And that area in and of itself is 20% larger than Austria. So this gives you a sense of scale. And thinking about what you referred to, Carolina, and what Lucia Pietrojusti has said about working beyond the walls of the institution, we are required to do that in such a large area. So it's not just something that is theoretically interesting, it is a demand, and it's super interesting. I'm not Sami, but we are engaging very much with the Sami artists, Sami culture, and the Sami people have been in this area for thousands and thousands of years. And it's a colonized area. This nation state of Sweden started to control it more and more from the 16th century onwards through taxing, etc. And up until the middle of the 20th century, as you can see on the right-hand side, the reindeer herding Sami, it's not that all Sami people are reindeer herders, but it's an important part of Sami culture, were passing through the town of Kiruna on their move back and forth between where they spend the winter with the reindeer in the forest in the relative southeast to going to the mountains in the northwest in the summer for the grazing lands there. Today, Kiruna, or Giron in Sami, is dominated by a mine called the LKAB mine. It is the world's largest underground iron ore mine. It is huge, and it's been there since 1900. And now it is so big that it is threatening old Kiruna. The ground is hollowed out. So these buildings in old Kiruna have been torn down. Other buildings have been moved. Here you can see what it looks like now. You have construction sites, you see fences because they're constantly tearing down buildings. And they are being moved to New Kiruna, which is 5 kilometers away. And that's what you can see on the left-hand side. The first building in New Kiruna was the City Hall, the circular building, and it's inside the City Hall that the museum is located. The church that you can see on the right-hand side from 1912 will be moved in August of this year. It's 40 by 40 meters and it weighs 600 tons. They're constructing a special road. They have demolished a viaduct, etc. It will take 2 days to move it to its new location in New Kiruna. It will be televised live, and the hotel rooms are already booked out. Journalists from all over the world are coming to cover this spectacular event. So the City Hall was inaugurated in 2018. The interior is characterized by a lot of gold. It's a labyrinthic structure. It's a wow building. You enter and it's big. It is spectacular. It doesn't look like anything else, I would say, that I have experienced architecturally speaking. Or what would you say, Gabriela? No. Very special. And this is where the museum is located. So Kin Museum of Contemporary Art has existed since 2018. It's municipal and regional. And we're constantly interweaving the local, the regional, the national, and the international. And the starting point is dig where you stand. This is a quote from a Swedish writer who in the 70s actually started virtual popular movement, encouraging people to research their local history, particularly the history of their workplaces. Study circles, etc., were set up in Sweden, but a lot in Germany as well. So dig where you stand. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can actually learn a lot from what is nearby and of course, cross-pollinate that with influences from elsewhere. So the first challenge for me when I came was that the museum had not been functioning particularly well, and it was understaffed, and it was not visible in this city hall context. So we invited 2 local Sami artists and 2 graphic designers who together developed our new visual dialect, as we call it, using green as a signal color to be able to navigate the building, because the exhibition spaces are on 5 different floors. So you have to move around a lot in order to find the art in question. And the visuals, in addition to the color green, are very much based on vernacular visual culture, i.e. Sami visual culture. So the decorative elements are directly linked to, for instance, old calendars, Sami calendars, and it is changing all the time. It's not supposed to be permanent, but to give a sense of the change of time. And many of the symbols are directly related to, for instance, the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and other important dates in the Sami calendar. So here you can see the lobby furniture in clay. It's an artwork. It's a functional sculpture by Luca Frey, an artist from Lugano who's based in Malmö. And it's a fantastic structure because, as you can see here, it is both a bookshop and a reception desk. But at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when the museum is closing, you can fold both elements so they become like 2 cupboards on wheel, and you can move them to the side. There are quite often events in the lobby space, so it was necessary to find a solution whereby that could be facilitated. This is what it looks like from above. So the building has these circular balconies with the offices of the civil servants and the politicians in the outer ring, so to speak, and the museum, and also the assembly rooms of the municipal parliament, as it were, in the middle. So you have volumes in the middle, and then you have these rings of offices around them. Yeah, here just a few words about the visual dialect. It was, as you can imagine, really crucial to work closely with some of the local artists there, Inga Victoria Pove and Fredrik Prost. So, dig where you stand, Sven Lindqvist. And then we're doing 3 long-term inquiries. You can think of them as thematic strands. So rather than having one group exhibition on a certain topic, which easily leads to a situation where you just tick off and say, okay, now we did this topic, now we move on to the next. We want to pursue certain inquiries over several years. So Hand, Heart, and Brain deals with artists who are interested in manual labor, craft. They're learning old craft techniques, repurposing them. This is something that I've been interested in for 15 years or more, and it is really fascinating to work with it at KIN because of the very strong tradition in terms of craft. Women in the North, it's a fairly macho place, so to insist on bringing in women and the history of women feels urgent. The critical zone, everything that goes on between the crust of the earth and the end of the atmosphere. Again, as you can imagine, with a mine it is definitely something that's in front of our noses. And actually, one can say that many of the big questions of our time, extractivism, indigenous rights, climate change, all of it is super present. The closer you get to the poles, the more aggressive is climate change. So, for instance, reindeer herders say that this year there was no winter, really. It was more what they would call spring. Snow, yes, but not nearly as much as there should be. So just to give you a little sense of what we're actually doing, you can check out our website yourselves. We're operating with 4 languages as much as we can. We don't manage to translate exactly everything. So it is Swedish, North Sami, Meänkieli, which is a Finnish dialect. There is a minority. They were actually settlers once upon a time from the northern parts of Finland and Sweden who came to this area, and the language is still spoken. So it's like an archaic version of Finnish and English. The art workshop is central to what we're doing. It's an open space. You recognize the balconies, so we cannot close the doors. We're in the middle of everything, for good and for bad. And we're using it for workshops with school classes. In this case, it's a team from a state authority who came over for a guided tour, and then afterwards they wanted a workshop. We also do workshops with children during school breaks, etc. And we have now changed the appearance and hindered a bit of the openness in terms of some of the participants feeling a bit like animals at a zoo before. And we have worked closely with the Sami craftswoman and artist Katarina Spikskum, who has made an installation which is a Sami alternative to interior design, if you wish, using reindeer hides for the bean bags. The wall dividers are modeled on traps for grouse, etc. So in terms of the increase, the hand, heart, and brain was important for one of the exhibitions in 2024, Textile Magic, where the lady in the wheelchair was the trampoline for us. Doris Wiklund, who since the 50s has been the one person who has been teaching textile craft in Kiruna, weaving and other forms of textile techniques. And this was her first show in Kiruna, first proper exhibition, spanning from the 50s until 2024. And she is also important because she has gathered a lot of textile material, documenting things that would otherwise have been forgotten, and self-published a series of books. She took a loan on her house and published them at great risk, actually. But we didn't want to only focus on her. We invited 3 younger artists with more experimental approaches to textile, Matilda Kente being one of them. And she spent about 8 weeks weaving in the exhibition space, a project that was an homage to Doris Wiklund, the 94-year-old artist. We also had Maja Fredin, who is a recent graduate from an art school in Stockholm, who works much more sculpturally with textile. And Kristina Pashkova, intuitive weaving, where during the pandemic, she made diaries in the form of these tapestries where things that she found on the ground when she went to the grocery store would become part of the tapestries. 3 weeks into the exhibition, Doris Wiklund passed away. So it was the last moment, really. The observatory, Art and Life in the Critical Zone, the critical zone being one of the inquiries with artists who in many different ways have been dealing with what goes on between the crust of the earth and the end of the atmosphere. For example, Fernando Garcia Dori and his Inland project, Ingela Irman with her spectacular sculptures that are often also costumes that are worn for performances, and they're of animals and plants. So it's ethnobiology, you could say, the relationship between humans and other living beings. I'm just going to scroll through here because we should have time to discuss. But you can get a sense here also that it's important with gatherings. You spoke, Carolina, about the discursive. The discursive can be structured and formal, but it can also be a bit more informal. So we are often doing talks with artists in the space next to the artworks that are perhaps a little bit more fluid than your usual symposium, for example. There is a collection. It's a collecting institution. By now we have around 130 artworks. And Britta Marakatlaba on the right, it's a graphic work by her. I will soon tell you more about her. Interweaving the local, the regional, the national, and the international in many different ways means that we also have a work in the collection by Besad Khosravi Nouri, who's from Tehran, based in Stockholm since around 2010. And a work that was shown in a group exhibition immediately when I arrived in 2023. So the collection is growing by us purchasing works with which we have worked. So we don't go to galleries and shop art, but it is art that is already part of the biotope, let's say, of the institution. Konstfesten, we've done it twice in February. So it's a way of gathering many people at the same time. 23,000 people live in the whole municipality of Kiruna, 18,000 in the town. So as you can imagine, we partly need to construct our own context. And one way of doing that is to have concentrated moments with several openings at the same time, seminars, symposia. And this is the Konstfest of last year with around 35 people traveling and also locals participating. And then we collaborate. We rarely do anything without it being a collaboration of some kind. So for instance, here with the Sami Theater, here with the local library. And we're also commissioning work, trying to work long-term. So for instance, here, the artist Dee Harding, based in Paris now, but from Queensland originally, has been on 2 site visits, and he will participate in a group show next year, but already now he's collaborating with 2 Sami schools, one in Kiruna and one in a small village, where he's using ochre from the earth in Queensland, and together with the kids, developing a way of painting which comes from his Aboriginal background, and painting on windows is part of that. We're also now working with Ottobong Nkanga. That's actually why I'm in New York now, to attend her performance at MoMA tomorrow. So she's also been on 2 site visits. The last one was in early March. And now we're coming to Britta Marakatlaba, who some of you might remember from Documenta in 2017. She was one of the 9 Sami artists. And she lives in a village in the Kiruna municipality. And since the late 60s, she's worked with embroidery and appliqué, telling stories about Sami history, mythology, and contemporary life, very much drawing on traditions, but here also directly relating to lifestyles pertaining to reindeer herding, for instance, with the beds on the right-hand side within a circular lavu or a circular tent, which would be the traditional way of living during the times when you're moving with the reindeer. And she has also become known for her political engagement in terms of big events, so protesting against the damming of rivers. And this is a detail of the 24-meter long embroidery, Historia, showing a group of Sami people in awe, do you say at or of, the universe and the cosmos and the starry sky. And it's a part of this piece. When it was shown at Documenta, it was on a flat wall, but for the retrospective that was first in Oslo, and then we took it, and it will eventually be shown at Moderna Museet. It has a circular vitrine, which is congenial because it is about circular time. It's, you know, an amazing artwork. A month ago, it was deemed the 35th most important artwork in the 2000s by Art News. And of course, the local newspapers were thrilled. And it was when we still had this piece up at the museum. So we showed it in the lobby of the museum. Just a few installation shots from her retrospective. And as part of her retrospective, we invited an indigenous artist from Himalaya, Aki Itami. So she spent almost 3 months at the museum in Kiruna, getting to know Britta and her work, but also other indigenous artists. And here, I would just like to say a few words about how we work, and perhaps we can frame this as working curatorially, at least how I thought of it when I was writing that first text, namely to think about how you bring something up at a particular place, a particular point in time. And if then when you do a retrospective with somebody like Britta Marakatlaba, who I would say is something very unusual. She's a high-profile, sophisticated artist, but also extremely popular and known to many people beyond the art circles. Well, we started to think about what are the artworks by her that exist in the region of Norrbotten 365 days per year. So we identified them in 3 other towns of the region. And then we did seminars in front of those artworks on site. So this is one of those sites. It's a museum in the town of Jokkmokk, where they have a curtain, like in front of a cinema screen. So again, dig where you stand. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but look at things that are near you and activate them. Activate public artworks. And we also did a number of public events, inviting an investigative journalist who has written about the issues that Britta Marakatt-Labba brings up in her work, for instance, climate change, and the other things I mentioned with extractivism, indigenous rights, etc. And he in turn invited researchers and, as you can see on this slide, reindeer herders. So young reindeer herders who talked about what it is actually like today when new mines are being opened, when there is not enough snow, for instance. And all of you can go and see Britta's work at the High Line. This was inaugurated, I think, a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. It's called The Primeval Mother, Urmoden. And these figures appear a lot in her embroidered work. It's women with a red horn cap, which was worn by Sami women up until the middle of the 19th century, when the church decided that the horn was the tool of the devil. But some women continued wearing them, but sort of hiding and so on. And Britta has brought them back in her work, and now they're actually quite popular again among Sami women. And we're working with other indigenous artists. So this is Glyceria Tupinamba from Bahia, and we're showing her magical cloak, a feather cloak. So that was my last slide. So I think I would like to conclude by saying that giving a sort of report from the floor of the workshop might say more about a certain approach than, let's say, intentionally theorizing about curating and the curatorial and the relation between the two. So let's see if that is true or not.
Thank you. Do you want to stop sharing the screen?
I need to stop sharing. Stop share.
Or if you want to do that, Connor. Thank you. Well, so maybe we could have a couple of questions between us, and then we open to the floor. Maria, can I start?
Yes, of course. I mean, the floor is yours.
Excellent. So there's I have a curiosity. You've been director of different institutions, and there's something about those first thoughts when you come to a new project, a new institution, not least now a museum. I know you have experience working in museums, of course, before, but Tensta was quite different. So I wanted to ask you, what are your absolute priorities as a curator, a thinker, a citizen, a director of the institution? What are the non-negotiables, the things that you really need to have on the table? They might be tangible or intangible, but what are those things that you really bring with you?
That art is a form of understanding, and that it has this unique capacity to absorb everything that exists around us, and then it can reformulate, it can reshape and produce proposals and questions the way that no other form of understanding that I'm aware of can do, because it combines all the other forms of understanding, potentially. You know, philosophy, politics, science, religion, it can all be part of it. And the non-negotiable part is that this should be center stage, and I would like as many people as possible to have access to it without compromising the integrity of the art and the people that engage with it.
So when you move to practicalities with that idea in mind, How do you go about activating those things?
It has to start with the artworks in relation to the institution. So what are the tools? What does the toolbox look like? Everything from the budget to the space to the team. I should also mention that there is a fantastic team at KIN, mainly young people full of energy, but only 7.7 full-time people in 2024. So what can we do with the team that we have? Luckily, it has grown, so it's twice as big as when I came. And exactly how that happens, I cannot tell you. It's not an algorithm. It's organic. So tweaking and thinking, how could we do that? With whom could we collaborate? Where would it make sense to present it? Is it in one of the 5 exhibition spaces in the city hall, or is it maybe somewhere else in the region, or outside the building in Kiruna itself?
Because you did say that you are organizing your program around 4 main strands, right? You call inquiries. Could you tell us a little bit more about how they work? So in practical terms, like, are you defining them with your team? Are you involving other groups from the city or the region to help you do that and identify priorities? How are you designing them?
Well, first of all, it's not that everything has to be part of the 3 inquiries. I mean, the basic one is dig where you stand. That's sort of the first prerequisite. And then the 3 inquiries, and they can flow in and out of the program. Britta Marakatt-Labba's exhibition, for instance, it's part of all 3 of them. It is the critical zone, it's women in the north, it's hand, heart, and brain. So that being said, for now, it's been me and some members of the team, not all of them, looking at this. It would be lovely to widen the circle, but then you have to have a much bigger team in order to conduct discussions like that in a meaningful way. And it's so small, so we don't have a curator because the money we have to simply go to the other necessary functions. So it's mostly me curating, and sometimes we've had also guest curators.
I probably have one more question or a couple more if Stephen allows. Yes. So there's a difference between Tensta and KIN Museum, and one of them, not only the location, not only the neighborhood, etc., but one of the things that I find particular is the fact that you have a collection now.
Yeah.
And that was not the case, if I'm not mistaken, in Tensta. What does it do to your work? Because probably to contextualize the question, there's something about inheriting, I think, an institution that comes with a particular legacy, not least if they are artworks or artifacts, to care for them and to make sure that you are involving them somehow in the work you're doing. You didn't mention how big the collection is. It sounded
around 130 works.
130 works. So what does that do to the way in which you are curating and organizing the exhibitions? Do you think it's more limiting in relation to what you were doing at Tensta, or just tell us a little bit how the collection changes the approach?
Well, it was actually one of the things that I was attracted by, that there is a collection and the possibility to build a collection, and to build a collection that is not following market trends, but which is trying to write a slightly different history. And because we are municipal and regional, of course, we have to take that into consideration. But that is not so difficult because it's anyway what we're working with. So I think it's a bonus to have that collection. It was really small when I came, and the rest of the team is also new actually by now. And in that way, we can shape it through the program.
Mhm. And can you give us an example of how you are bringing those artifacts to dialogue, maybe as part of other exhibitions you are curating with?
Yes, so for instance, we have just purchased a work by a collective which is based in Luleå. It's another town in the region of Norrbotten, the bigger town in the region, called Norra Kollektivet, the North Collective, and they have made a number of works in relation to a particular site near that town where there is another mine. It's another mining company, and it's an open pit mine. So it is in a way more brutal because it's a huge hole, and it is expanding. So it's constantly eating the forest and nearby villages, etc. So they have been following this in a rather poetic way. So we are working with them in a project which takes as its starting point a photographer who was active in Kiruna from 1900 until he died in the 50s. And the municipality has his estate. So they have around 3,500 glass plates. A lot of it is digitized. So we have invited 3 artists to make new work from or looking at this photographer, Bori Mesh. And one of them is Norra Kollektivet, this collective that I mentioned. So what they will make is unclear because the project has just begun. But we have, in the meantime, now purchased one of their works. So we will for sure show that. And then there will be another work, a commission by them. So that's one example. And one of the back thoughts with working with this photographer is that the municipality is not showing any of his work. It's a treasure, super, super interesting. And I hope that through the project with the contemporary artists, we can also facilitate the showing of some of Bori Mesh's photographs too. It is something that many visitors and many inhabitants would be interested in. So we're baking that into our contemporary art project. So that's another difference here at KIN, that a number of projects that we're doing are actually having a clear historical and cultural historical dimension. In Tensta, there was no collection, as you correctly mentioned, but we did a multi-year project, another inquiry there that we called Tensta Museum, where we pretended that this little brittle art center was actually a museum. And then we also pretended that the neighborhood of Tensta, a residential late modernist suburb, was our collection. And an example of how this historical or cultural historical aspect comes into the program is that we will actually do a Picasso show in the fall. I never thought I would make a Picasso show, but 60 years ago, there was a big Picasso exhibition in the old City Hall of Kiruna. In 1965, the mining company turned 75 years. So more than 100 works by Picasso were borrowed from the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, the National Museum, the Art Museum in Gothenburg, etc. And it was a sensation, of course, to show Picasso in this location. People still remember it. So now we are borrowing about a dozen of the same works.
It's kind of a reenactment.
A reenactment in terms of those graphic works and a couple of sculptures. We cannot afford the insurance fee for the paintings. The one painting, it's $15 million just the insurance value. So, and then we have invited Dora Garcia who is from Madrid and who, as an artist from Spain, grew up with Picasso. So she will look at his legacy from a rather critical point of view, and also the show in 1965, because certainly that was an early form of art washing.
Mhm. So you will have Dora's work and Picasso exhibition at
In the same, it's the same show.
Okay, interesting.
So they will be overlapping.
Okay, so before I open to the floor, just a quick question around your thoughts about this discussion that I mentioned in my presentation around the curatorial and curating. How do you see that now? Do you think it was fruitful? Do you think it kind of played a role somehow in opening up probably a space for practices and probably visibility? I think they are already taking place. It was not that the theory came in order to organize things. They were definitely there. So do you think it did something to the field? What are your thoughts now in hindsight?
It seems like it had some effect, because you're talking about it, you're writing about it, some other people do, which is really interesting. I would not have imagined. But one thing to remember is that it came so much out of practical work. And to me, it is essential that the curatorial stands for not accepting status quo. And that what Irit Rogoff was doing when she was writing about this, and Beatrice from Bismarck, we were all seeing each other a lot, you know, from the late 90s onwards. There were so many events. All of a sudden, airfares were cheap. So there was an ongoing discussion. There was a sense of real exchange, and we met like this. It was not online, but physical encounters, and that generated something. There was a certain energy somehow. I think that is different today. You can find some of it, but it's much more, as far as I can tell, dispersed. And that's where I think the future lies, with working in a really situated manner. It can be far away from the beaten tracks, but it can be deeply meaningful. And of course, people tend to be networked in different ways. Mm-hmm. But this sense of knowing that you would actually physically see each other in a few months again, that's not there.
Mm-hmm. The conversation continues.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And if there are, I'm sure there are thoughts and comments and questions.
So I'll just begin by asking, since we have two poles in a way here, it's a continuum between the theoretical and the practical. It feels like what you're saying, and when I think about the importance of Pensa, which was very generative for theory, in fact, there's been so much written about it, thought about it in terms of its theoretical value, in terms of its blueprint for other forms of curatorial work. It's generative in that sense, but I have to say I'm a little amused because, you know, so much that we even say here in the program when we talk about Maria Lind, it's this great theoretical figure as well as someone who's done a lot of important curatorial work, curating. Is that journey for you one in which it was always the case that the theoretical, except for that moment in which you were with Beatrice and Irit, etc., has it always been generated from the actual practice of making shows, that the theoretical was in a way something collateral? Or, you know, when I think about what, of course, Carolina does, is to say that, well, these are different but contiguous forms of knowledge production. Some that are more cognitive in a way, more abstract, and some that are experiential. So where in your journey does the theoretical fall in relationship to the practical?
I think of myself as a fairly nerdy person. I read a lot. I'm also writing a lot, but these days it's mostly, you know, text for the folders, the exhibition folders. For more than 30 years, 35 years now, I've been rolling on 3 wheels in contemporary art. It's writing, it's curating, and it is education or teaching in different forms. And they come together. But and also when I wrote the text on the curatorial, I didn't write about my own work. I wrote about other people's work. For instance, Tirdad Solgader's UAE pavilion in Venice. So it's based on my own hands-on experience, as well as experiencing other people's projects, talking to artists and thinkers, etc. So I'm saying this to just clarify that it's not so clear cut. I think all of them are there at the same time, but there is a collateral sense to it at the same time, which is that as I have been doing things, whether it was at the Kunstverein in Munich or at Jaspis or at Bard and Tensta and so on, not much has been written about it during the time when we have been making, me and the teams have been creating those programs. So I sometimes also felt that I had to write things down in order to document them. And writing comes easily. So that's maybe what you could call theorizing. But it's not that I'm sitting down and thinking, oh, I have to create a theory around this.
Just a quick question, Connor, are we keeping an eye on people online if there's any questions?
Oh, questions? I don't know.
Yeah, we don't hear. Is it here? Shall we keep an eye?
Maybe
Shall
you
we-
can, I have my,
Okay.
I don't have the right glasses.
Let's see if we can. Just wondering if, but in the meantime, please, if you have any
Just be on the Zoom.
questions. Interesting.
As well, we answer Steve's question. Excuse me. Maria, I thought you gave a pretty convincing, practicum.
It's just a comment.
What
Okay.
Carolina's calling institution building or institution, infrastructure kind of, remaking. So whether you're writing the theory about it or actually doing it. I mean, I feel like there is still a
we don't
theoretical,
have
there's a
that
very
there.
principled
Yeah.
agenda at work, you know, in all the decisions you're making. So, but maybe other people will write about it as opposed to you writing, like, because you're so busy doing it, you know? I mean, I have a very
you.
straightforward practical question, which is, could you talk a little bit more about the Ottobock Nakanga collaboration and how it fits actually into those 4 inquiries that you laid out?
Yes, so I have worked with her before. She was in the Gwangju Biennale in 2016, so I'm very familiar with her practice, and I've also written about her work. And she was high on my wish list when I started as somebody, regardless of where I would work, I would love to do something with her. And as I mentioned, we hardly do anything that is not a collaboration. So in this case, we have teamed up with the Public Art Agency, which is a state agency that is responsible for art in public space. When you build a new building, it's almost like the 1% rule type of public art projects, but they also commission artists to do temporary projects. So me and Eddie Muke, who is the curator of that program line of the Public Art Agency, realized that both of us are really interested in Ottobock's work. And it's not that I thought of her as, you know, hand, heart, and brain, for instance, but my interests are anyway in that field. And once, her name was put down for both of us, it was clear that it would work really well with both Hand, Heart, and Brain and the Critical Zone. So now she's been, as I mentioned, visiting us twice. So she starts to have an idea. I shouldn't talk about it yet because it's so premature, but it involves making something together with other people locally, something physical.
Yes.
I'm really interested in what you guys said about process of knowledge making, knowledge producing. And I remember Carolina juxtaposed it with academia. And I wonder what would be the main difference that you classify between the knowledge producing in academia and knowledge producing through the cultural institutions. Those two can help each other.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's a great question. Well, maybe gives me an opportunity also to go back to the theory and practice divide. I really don't subscribe to that distinction as it is. I am a practitioner and also a researcher, and actually my research is conducted through the means of practice. And so I really struggle to understand this. One of the things is when we're talking about theory or texts that talk about cultural outputs, curatorial projects, exhibitions, whatever that is. But the other thing is how we engage also intellectually with things. And I think as practitioners, we are always doing that. And so it's part of, I think, of our métier and the ways we engage with materials, be it ideas or artworks. And in relation to that, I think the question is very relevant. I mean, there's something that always fascinated me, which is really this question about how can we think of cultural institutions as sites of knowledge production. And because most of my institutional positions in cultural institutions have been that I have always some sort of relationship with the local universities for some reason. So when I was at Nottingham Contemporary, for instance, as head of public programs, I decided to add research to that, to the title, because research was something that I wanted to sort of experiment as a term to make space for different kinds of cultural engagements. So I wanted to think, especially against the backdrop of a lot of the imperatives in the field, in the cultural sector, in terms of performance, in terms of delivery, in terms of footfall, it is crazy busy, as I'm sure Maria subscribes, and not least, I think the fact why you also doubled your team eventually to respond to that demand. So one of the things I wanted to do at Nottingham Contemporary was to try and slow down that expectation. And so to turn the public programs and research into a curatorial department, meaning that we had the exhibitions departments, but the public programs were not the learning activities or adult learning activities or children and family activities. It was a department on its own right. And so to start thinking of how we could develop a series of curatorial activities that would engage not only public facing things, so events and exhibitions and so on, but also kinds of activities that are running in the background. And so with that idea in mind, with research in mind, really thinking, okay, how are curatorial activities and programming in this kind of more expanded field, not only exhibitions, of course, but also engaging with these different ideas, are producing a particular way of understanding the world. A little bit like what Maria said at the beginning, one of the non-negotiables. There's something about artistic practices that really engage with a way of understanding the world that is very, very particular. So if we could understand well, of course we know intuitively, but also to make sure that we were researching internally as a team, also making sure that we are identifying what those methodologies are. And so the program was dedicated to, of course, kind of be able to enact those ideas. And so we had what we called research strands, I think very similar to what you call inquiries. Research strands were these ideas, these questions that we run for 2 to 3 years, really, where we were not aiming at presenting a show or an activity that would summarize or represent the question, the topic, but very much kind of being able to, through time, with different audiences and publics and participants and actors that sometimes would move from being curators and then being participants and then audience and then back again to organizing. So really enabling that, I think, fluidity in terms of the capacities and roles, at the same time that we were generating new audiences around concerns instead of identities, because this is another discussion, I think, relevant, maybe not today, we don't have time, but and so to use those long-term research strands as a way for us to entertain those questions and together create what Paul O'Neill calls thinking with our audiences. So to go through a question, to come from a question, and then through various iterations of some of them more visible, more public than others, kind of create knowledge about that particular question or even urgency. And so there's something very specific. I mean, now being back in academia, but running a program on practice research. So again, my colleagues, my team are mainly practitioners, researchers that work in the field of art and design and conduct their research through practice, photography, film, visual artists, performers, musicians, etc. Of course, we do have to advocate for a kind of research engagement that is very distinct from what my colleagues are doing in the engineering department, for instance. And so that is challenging notions of rigor. Our methodologies are usually understood, and I'm talking about how they are usually peer-reviewed in the field, in academia, are seen as being not rigorous enough, for instance. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we are asking questions from a very specific positionality, including us as individuals as part of the inquiry. We are not sitting outside of the subject matter. We are part of this. So those differences in terms of the positionality of the researcher, the engagement with the subject matter, and how you go about researching that, they are very, very distinct. Well, I've written a little bit about that, so I'm happy to pass on some of those references, but that's something that really, I think, very important, urgent for academia to create space in academia for those practices. But equally, one of the things I'm interested in is a collaboration between the two sectors, because I really think it creates a different set of conditions away from those neoliberal imperatives from cultural sector. Well, not saying that academia is out of that, of course not, but also to legitimize, validate some of these methodologies that I was referring to in relation to academia. So I think there's a lot of benefits in that collaboration. Thank you.
And the initial question was about your non-negotiables, right? And you mentioned something about the art and the artist. And I wanted to know if there was any specific conflicts and battles in order to present the work.
Conflicts with art and artists in relation to how to present their work. Is that
Meaning like if you had to compromise in order or change the work in order to present it within the community or sponsors or patrons or
so far we have not had to compromise. The way that I have worked for a long time is to be in close dialogue with the artists that we're working with. So making sure that for every step, we agree, so to speak. And it's either starts with an invitation for a particular artwork that is already existing, or
I mean, in your career as a curator? Like, have you had conference where you had to like stand up for the art and the artist? And you had people trying to censor the work? Or
No, luckily not, but I've had a situation where language has been censored. This is now basically 20 years ago when I was the director of Jaspis, which is a state authority. So it's sorting under the Ministry of Culture in Sweden. And the director of the state agency at the time, she prohibited us from using the word bureaucracy.
Okay.
Apparently it was very sensitive. And I think it was because she didn't want to feel like a bureaucrat. So
how did you deal with that?
I continued using it.
Good.
That's of course a very mild situation. I was working for 3 years in Moscow, as you mentioned, or as Stephen mentioned, as the Counselor of Culture at the Embassy of Sweden. And obviously there I had to be careful. I don't think I had to compromise, but I had to be very careful, and mostly doing things under the radar. So for about a year of my time there, a year and a half, we could do things in public. For the last 1.5 years, we couldn't do anything in public because of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, my job was to maintain contact between cultural practitioners in Sweden and Russia and the contact between them.
Would you say that's where the art is more critical, when you they're giving you some written rules, you know, like you're afraid or really because of the conflict?
Well, there it was very political, you know, it was simply not possible. And I think it was right to step back at that point, to continue being active, but under the radar. Because that's how you can achieve something. You cannot do it it was really a situation where you couldn't do anything in the open. That would have jeopardized many things.
We have another question here.
Yeah, I was thinking about this approach of digging where you stand, and kind of if that's something that you developed more when working very regionally at Kiruna, or was that something that you practice kind of in every curatorial role, or how do you see that also in relation to this very like globalized, like is that a reaction to the very globalized moment, or do you feel like there is still place to having exhibitions or curatorial approaches that you try to transcend locality or to bring?
Did you hear at the back? Yeah, good. Just want to make sure that everybody's on board. It's been a concern of mine for a while, and maybe the clearest wake-up call was when I was at CCS Bard. I learned so much from those 3 years with the brilliant graduate students. And one thing was that I became convinced that in curatorial education or curating courses, it's essential to work with mediation. It's not enough just to make your thesis project, which is most of the time an exhibition. How does that land in the world? What are the conversations that you as a curator, as a student, want to have with, you know, individuals or groups of people around the artworks, taking the artworks and the exhibition as a context, as a starting point. And that also made me think a lot about locality on campus, the Hudson Valley, and so on. So I began to assign the students tasks where they needed to think about mediation locally. So with whom would they like to hook up around their project? That had to be part of it. And it's not that it didn't exist at all before, but then it gelled somehow. I actually met with Steffi Hester from the Swiss Institute this morning, whom I have known since she was a student of a curating course at the Stockholm University a long time ago. And I was really glad to hear her describe projects that she has done that are locally grounded in Manhattan. You know, looking at histories going back to the 70s and 80s in terms of particular squats where they worked with what we today would call green energy and so on. So I think Dig Where You Stand can be so enriching, regardless of where you are. And maybe it is more important in New York than in most other places, just to remember that this is as local and even as provincial as any other place.
I think it's just like maybe something because a lot of us are not New Yorkers, they're coming from other places, then it's something that we're trying to navigate between them. How much can we dig here if we're bringing things from our own backgrounds and kind of how to mediate.
And that's also when and where collaboration becomes so fruitful and interesting.
There's one question here.
Hi, I'm also a curator, and for me, like curating as with audience center in mind is very important to me. So actually, I have two questions here. One is for the knowledge production. For me, like producing knowledge is a little bit different from delivering knowledge to the audience, because producing knowledge is like more like a me researcher centered, and what I see is more important. I want to produce it, and delivering knowledge is for me is curatorial concept is like putting audience in the center to see like what they can perceive and is what is better for them. Like this is a little bit different for me, and I wanted to ask you about it a little, and also about the culture spaces, because especially post-COVID, I'm always thinking about like how the physical space is pretty important, because many of the things during COVID is online and can be coming online. And I should make an exhibition about discussing like how important is the physical space. And so I'm thinking about like the culture space as a place for social engagement. And I wanted to hear something about this concept, what you think about it.
Do you wanna? Yes. I think there's a very important difference between thinking of a research exhibition or a research curatorial output as something that I would define as conveying the findings that happen before the exhibition or the curatorial output, as in representing what was researched before, right? So that, for me, that would be a research exhibition. So the intention is, as you mentioned, to share knowledge that was eventually produced before, right? That's not what I mean when I talk about knowledge production within this framework of the curatorial. Would be actually to position the modes in which we research as part of the event of the exhibition. And so in that sense, you as a curator or an organizer or some person involved in the making, in the production of that output, of that curatorial output, you are as much as an audience as anyone else involved, as much as someone that is learning and trying to figure out what that particular event is offering as anyone else. So you really move away from the position of knowing and explaining and so on and so forth to where you are actually learning from that particular experience. And I think also crucially being able to identify what are the next steps. In addition to that, I think what we call dialogical platforms, which is basically another kind of format that is very much used in curatorial practices, where you engage in conversations and in some kind of exchange with people that are involved in that particular event, eventually such as this one, or in different formats that are less formal. Those are meant to complement those things, that the idea of thinking together, and that production of knowledge is happening within those structures and within those formats, not before. So in that sense, the audiences, the publics, also how those kinds of engagements really generate something that you can't really engineer in advance, which is the kinds of collaborations that emerge out of those encounters. And as I mentioned before, at Nottingham Contemporary, we had the experience of having regulars, so people that would come to the events related to one of the research strands, for instance, that very, very soon became also organizers of activities related to that strand. And so it was about generating an audience, a group of people that were interested in those particular questions and concerns, but also enabling the curatorial project to be owned by others. So it was never about us, the team, curating every single element of that strand at all. But of course, it takes time to pick up, for people to identify themselves with those interests, and then to start also the conversation in terms of the collaborations. So that idea of the audience is always embedded. It's just not thinking, I guess. I think what I would say here is I have some issues with the idea that you can curate for a specific audience. So the idea of there's a specific group and now I'm curating because I think that those individuals would be interested in this particular output, in this particular curatorial event or exhibition. I think that's a bit tricky, assuming that you know in advance. And so I think it's more generating audiences through the program, and thus those shifts of roles as well.
Helpful, yeah. I feel like it's like we're learning the line between the researcher and the audience, because audience could be part of the research, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
A challenge in relation to what you're bringing up is, of course, how do we as institutional workers make people who do not work with us feel welcome or even at home? How do we make possible for other people to use our space without making it too prescribed, let's say? So one very, very simple way that we developed at Tensta Konsthall, and which we're continuing now at KIN, is what we have called the dislocated staff meetings. So every other month, we do one of the weekly staff meetings somewhere else. You know, it would be wonderful if we had time to do study visits, just as study visits, but we don't have the time. But maybe that is also not bad, because when we do the dislocated staff meetings, we ask a school, a workplace, a company, if we can borrow one of their meeting spaces for our internal meeting. But then we also ask if they can show us around, tell us about their activities. This, at the same time, gives us the opportunity to talk about our institutions and how we work. And then we can invite them back to us and offer them the same opportunity to use our meeting space, and we can give them a tour of current exhibitions, etc. And this has generated many contacts on a kind of nice level. It seems to even the playing field somehow. And the other thing I was thinking about is actually the terminology we use. We shouldn't be too wound up with language, but sometimes it's also good to be attentive. I was thinking about when you use the word audience of what Martha Rosler has said and written, which is that for her, there is a major difference between the audience and the public. So the public, that was what she experienced in Soho, etc., in the 70s, when the people who came to an event would recognize each other. They might not know each other's names, but they would somehow be familiar with each other. The audience, which is numerically larger, appeared with the big blockbuster exhibitions, you know, the art from Mexico or art from Brazil. I can't remember exactly which ones they were, but the Guggenheim did some of them here in New York in the 80s, and maybe some of the other museums too, when there was no chance for you to recognize the other people. It had become anonymous. I find it a little tricky to use either of the terms. So I tend to think about the people that we engage with and that come to the museum as visitors, as participants occasionally, and quite often as partners of some kind, because we're doing so many collaborations. I don't think we can escape the connotations of the public and the audience, but at least in my mind, it helps me be maybe a little bit more specific in relation to who they are, not generalizing and essentializing, which is the danger of exactly what you said. You know, we're going to curate for that group. How on earth can we even imagine that we can do that?
Do we have any burning question? Because I think it's time for us to start wrapping up. I think, yes, I get a nod from Stephen. So
Is there somebody online? We check.
we tried. Oh, damn. There's questions. So using Dig where you stand, how do you work within local community without tokenizing? What are your steps to building relationships? This is from Renee. And then there's another question, but it's a comment for me. So I think, Maria, this question is for you.
How you think where you stand, how do you work with thing or local community without tokenizing? What are your steps to building relationships? Well, the first steps are always a bit like what I said with the dislocated staff meetings. You get out there and you knock on people's doors and say hello, ask, would you have time to meet with me and tell me about what you're doing? That's what I am spending a lot of time doing, and have done so for my last 3, 4, 5 jobs, you know. And if you show an interest in other people, they're quite likely to show an interest in you and what you're doing as well. So curiosity and devoting a bit of time to what other people are doing. That would be the first steps in terms of dig where you stand.
Okay. There's one final request here. Connor, are we saving the chat box? Are we saving, because I will have to send some references to Namita.
I don't know if Q&A gets saved. We can connect it.
Is saved? Okay, so just to confirm, Namita, I'll be in touch in the next couple of days. And thank you so much for your interest. So I think I will close this event. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us. Maria, thank you so much for your
Thank you,
generous
Carolina.
sharing with us, and Stephen and the team for hosting.
You both.
Thank you.